The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Even the sound of footsteps seemed to echo longer than usual. People filled every row of seats, whispering softly while waiting for the hearing to begin. Reporters sat ready with their notebooks, cameras pointed at the front. Everyone was there for one reason: the custody case that had captured the town's attention. It was about a young boy named Eli, whose future would be decided that day. Eli sat at the corner of the courtroom beside a social worker. His small hands gripped a blue toy car, the only thing that made him feel safe. He was just 10 years old but looked even younger sitting in that big wooden chair. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he could feel that something important was about to change. His eyes moved slowly from one parent to the other. His mother sat on one side, her arms crossed tightly. His father sat across from her, his face pale and tired. They avoided each other's gaze, but both looked at their son with heavy hearts. The judge entered the room and everyone stood up. He was an older man, calm and serious, known for being strict but fair. He adjusted his glasses and looked around before speaking. "Let's begin," he said in a firm voice. The sound of paper shuffling followed as the lawyers stood up. The mother's lawyer spoke first. He talked about how Eli's mother had raised him alone for the past 3 years, how she worked 2 jobs, and how she gave her son a stable home. He described her as strong and caring, someone who always put her child first. Eli watched his mother's eyes fill with tears as the lawyer continued to speak. She wiped them away quickly and took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Then it was the father's turn. His lawyer stood, but the father spoke for himself. He didn't look confident. His hand shook slightly as he stood up and faced the judge. His voice was rough but honest. "Your Honor," he began, "I know I've made mistakes. I know I wasn't there like I should have been, but I've changed. I'm not the man I used to be." The courtroom was silent. Every word seemed to echo. The father continued, explaining how he had lost his job a few years ago and had turned to drinking. He admitted that it had destroyed his marriage and almost ruined his life. But he said he had been sober for over a year now. He showed papers from a counseling center and letters from his employer confirming that he now held a steady job. "I just want a chance to be in my son's life again," he said softly. "I want to do things right this time." Eli's eyes filled with confusion. He had seen his father only a few times in the past year. He didn't know if he believed everything his father said, but something about his voice sounded different now. Less angry, more sincere. The boy's small fingers moved over the toy car nervously. He didn't want to choose sides, but deep down he wished his parents could stop fighting. The mother's lawyer stood again. "Your Honor," he said, "we've heard promises before. But the reality is, my client protected this child when no one else did. The father was not around when Eli needed him most. He cannot just walk back into their lives and expect everything to be fine." The judge nodded, taking notes quietly. His expression didn't change, but his eyes occasionally glanced toward the boy. He had seen many cases like this before. Parents lost in bitterness, children caught in the middle. Still, something about Eli's quiet presence made him uneasy. There was a sadness in the boy's eyes that he couldn't ignore. A few witnesses were called to speak. One of them was a neighbor who said she often saw the mother taking care of Eli alone. Another was a co-worker of the father, who said he had been trying hard to turn his life around. The testimonies went back and forth, each one painting a different picture. Some supported the mother, others defended the father. The truth seemed tangled somewhere in between. As the hours passed, the air in the courtroom grew heavier. Even the lights seemed dimmer, as if the building itself could feel the weight of the decision. Eli sat quietly through it all, swinging his legs, his small toy car resting on his knee. Every now and then his mother would look at him and smile faintly. His father tried to do the same, but their eyes never met for long. When the lunch break was announced, people stepped out to stretch. The father walked to the corner, leaning against the wall, breathing deeply. He looked exhausted. The mother stayed seated, talking softly to her lawyer. Eli was taken outside by the social worker. He sat on a bench watching pigeons fly across the courtyard. The sun felt warm on his face, but his mind was full of noise. He didn't know how to tell anyone how he felt. He loved his mom, but he missed his dad. He wanted peace, but he didn't know what peace looked like anymore. When everyone returned after the break, the courtroom felt even tenser. The mother's lawyer presented more evidence, documents showing the father's late payments and a record of a night when he had missed a visit. The father listened quietly, sometimes lowering his head. He didn't argue. He just waited for his turn to speak again. Finally, the judge allowed him to respond. The father looked up and spoke calmly. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can be better now. I've been sober, I've been working, and I've been praying for another chance to be a father. Not for me. For Eli." There was something genuine in his tone, something that caught the attention of even those who didn't believe in him. Still, the mother shook her head, whispering something to her lawyer. Her expression showed a mix of anger and pain. It wasn't just about trust, it was about years of disappointment. The judge finally leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I've heard both sides," he said, "and this is not an easy decision." His voice was calm but carried weight. Everyone in the room went still. He looked at the mother, then at the father, and finally at Eli. "Before I make my ruling, I'd like to hear from the child's representative tomorrow," he added. "We will continue this hearing." The session ended for the day, and people began to leave slowly. The father looked over at his son, hoping for a small smile, but Eli avoided his eyes. The mother quickly gathered her things and walked out with her lawyer. Outside the courtroom, the air felt thick and heavy. The reporters tried to get quotes, but both parents stayed silent. That night, Eli lay in bed at his mother's small apartment. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. His toy car rested beside his pillow. He thought about his dad's words, about how he wanted to be better. He wanted to believe it. He remembered the nights his father had read to him when he was younger, before things fell apart. But he also remembered the shouting, the slammed doors, and the times his mom cried in the kitchen. His heart was full of confusion he didn't know how to explain. At the same time, in a small rented room across town, his father sat alone by the window, staring at the streetlights. The papers from court lay on the table beside him. He picked up a photo of Eli, worn and faded from being carried around for years. "I'll fix this," he whispered to himself. No matter what it takes. The judge, too, couldn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk reading through the case files again. He had seen hundreds of cases like this one, but something about this family lingered in his mind. He wrote a few notes in the margin of the report and leaned back in his chair. He wondered what the boy really thought, what truths might be hidden behind that quiet stare. The next morning came quickly. The courthouse was full again. The judge took his seat, and the lawyers prepared for the continuation of the case. Eli walked in holding his toy car, wearing a clean shirt that seemed a size too big. His face was serious, almost too serious for a child his age. The social worker guided him to his seat. The judge began to speak, summarizing the case. "Today we'll hear the final statements," he said. "Then I'll make my decision." The tension in the room was like a held breath. The mother's lawyer stood first, repeating how his client had been the only stable figure in Eli's life. He asked the judge to grant full custody to her for the child's safety and well-being. He spoke confidently, his words polished and persuasive. Then the father's lawyer stood up. He spoke about forgiveness and second chances, about how people can change if given the opportunity. He reminded the judge that children need both parents when it's safe and possible. As he finished, he placed a photo of Eli and his father fishing together years ago on the table. The small image caught the judge's eye. Eli watched everything quietly, his little hands folded together. He could feel the grown-ups deciding his future, but no one was asking him what he wanted. The judge looked at him again, and for a brief second their eyes met. There was something in that look, something that said the boy knew more than anyone realized. When the judge finally said, "I'm ready to give my decision," the room fell completely silent. Everyone leaned forward, hearts pounding. But before he could continue, Eli's small hand twitched on the table. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to do next would change everything that followed, and make the entire courtroom remember his name. The moment hung in the air like a breath that no one dared to release. The judge had just said he was ready to give his decision when Eli suddenly stood up. His small chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor, making everyone turn toward him. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the judge froze, his gavel halfway in the air. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were steady. He held his toy car in one hand like it gave him strength. Then he said softly but clearly, "He's lying." For a moment, no one moved. The words sounded so out of place, so shocking, that everyone just stared. The judge blinked, confused. "What did you say, son?" he asked in a calm but cautious voice. Eli swallowed hard. His hands trembled, but he repeated it. He's lying. His voice was louder this time, echoing through the big room. The judge looked around, trying to understand. Who are you talking about? He asked gently. Eli pointed across the room at the man who had spoken earlier, his mother's boyfriend. The man looked startled, shifting in his seat. He glanced at Eli's mother, who turned pale as her lips parted in shock. The judge leaned forward, his tone serious now. Young man, please come here. Eli looked at the social worker, who nodded slightly, giving him silent permission. The boy walked slowly toward the front, his small shoes tapping softly against the floor. Everyone watched him, not sure what to expect. When Eli reached the front, he stopped near the judge's desk. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed them with a handkerchief, trying to keep his expression calm. Eli, he said gently, you understand that this is a very serious place, right? Whatever you say here has to be the truth. Eli nodded quickly. Yes, sir, he said quietly. The judge asked, who is lying and about what? The boy took a deep breath. He said my dad tried to hurt me, Eli said, pointing again at his mother's boyfriend. But that's not true. My dad never did that. He was mean sometimes before, but he never hurt me. It was him. The last word came out almost like a whisper, but it was clear enough for everyone to hear. Gasps filled the courtroom. The mother's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This child is under emotional pressure. But the judge raised his hand to stop him. The judge's face had gone pale and his eyes were fixed on the boy. Eli, he said softly, are you sure about this? The boy nodded. I didn't say anything before because he told me not to. He said if I told anyone, I'd get in trouble and my mom would be sad. The mother covered her mouth with her hands. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she turned toward the man beside her, who sat frozen, unable to meet her eyes. The father stood up suddenly, his chair falling backward. What? He shouted, his voice breaking. You... But the judge quickly ordered him to sit down. Please, calm down, he said firmly. Everyone needs to stay silent. The room was tense. No one spoke for a few long seconds. The judge took a deep breath and looked at the court clerk. We're going to take a short recess, he said. Then he turned to the bailiff. Please escort the boy and the social worker to my chambers. I'd like to speak with them privately. The gavel came down sharply. Court is in recess. Eli followed the social worker through a side door, still clutching his toy car. The judge's chambers were quieter, smaller, and filled with books. The judge came in a few minutes later, his expression calm but serious. He sat down and gestured for Eli to sit across from him. All right, Eli, he said kindly. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Take your time. No one here is going to get you in trouble. The boy's lips trembled, but he nodded. When Mom started seeing him, he began. He was nice at first. He bought me toys and told me to call him Uncle. But sometimes when Mom wasn't home, he'd yell at me. One time he grabbed my arm really hard and told me not to tell Mom or anyone else. Eli looked down at his hand, twisting the toy car nervously. He said if I told, I'd be taken away. The judge listened carefully, saying nothing. He just nodded slowly, letting the boy speak. When we came to court, Eli continued, he told me to stay quiet. He said Dad was bad and that if I said anything nice about him, the judge would send me somewhere far away. But Dad never hurt me. He just used to shout when he was mad. That's all. The social worker sitting beside him looked shocked. She had worked with Eli for months and never heard any of this before. The judge leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. Eli, he said softly, you're a very brave boy for telling the truth. I know that wasn't easy. The boy nodded slightly, his eyes filling with tears. I just want everyone to stop fighting, he whispered. I just want to be with both of them. The judge felt something tighten in his chest. He reached for a tissue box and handed one to the boy. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of a clock. Then the judge stood up and said quietly to the social worker, Thank you for bringing him in. I'll handle the rest from here. When the court resumed, everyone could feel the change in the air. The judge's face looked pale, his jaw set firmly. The mother's boyfriend avoided eye contact with anyone, his hands trembling on the table. The mother looked devastated, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The father sat completely still, staring straight ahead, his knuckles white. The judge cleared his throat and spoke. Before we continue, I want to remind everyone that this courtroom stands for truth and justice. What was just revealed is serious, and I will not take it lightly. He paused, glancing toward the mother's lawyer, who looked visibly nervous. "New information has come to light," the judge continued, "and I am ordering an immediate investigation into the testimony we heard earlier." He looked at Eli's mother directly. "Ma'am," he said gently, "did you know about any of this?" She shook her head, tears still streaming down her face. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I thought he was helping us. I thought he cared about Eli." She turned her eyes toward her boyfriend, who looked down at the table, silent. The judge nodded, then turned to the father. "Sir, I owe you an apology for how this case began," he said seriously, "but I must still consider what's best for your child. This isn't about blame anymore, it's about healing." The father nodded, his voice quiet. "I understand, Your Honor. I just want my son to be safe." The judge looked back at Eli, who sat quietly with the social worker. "And he will be," the judge said firmly. The next few minutes were filled with quiet conversation among the lawyers and the court staff. Reporters whispered to each other, already sensing that this case had just taken an unexpected turn. The judge ordered the bailiff to detain the boyfriend for questioning. He was led out of the courtroom, eyes wide with fear. The sound of his footsteps echoed as the doors closed behind him. Eli's mother broke down, covering her face. The father hesitated, then took a small step forward. For a moment he looked at her, not with anger but with sadness. The two had fought for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to care about the same thing. Now, for the first time in years, they both cried for the same reason: their son. The judge cleared his throat again. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said. "But I will say this now. What this boy did today took more courage than most adults ever show. The court owes him our respect." Eli looked up shyly, unsure how to react. The judge gave him a small nod before leaving the bench. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was crowded. Reporters called out questions, but the family said nothing. The father walked beside the social worker as she guided Eli out of the building. The boy looked tired, but there was a strange sense of relief in his eyes, like a heavy secret had finally been lifted. That night, Eli's mother sat alone in her living room, staring at the empty chair across from her. She thought about everything her son had said. She felt guilt, anger, and sorrow all tangled together. She had trusted someone who had lied to her, and worse, had let her son live in fear. She picked up her phone, hesitated for a moment, then called the father. "Thank you," she said softly when he answered, "for being patient and for not giving up." He was silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "He's our boy. We both need to do better." Eli slept peacefully that night for the first time in a long while. The toy car was still in his hand, but his face looked calm. The world around him was changing, but at least now the truth was out. In another part of town, the judge sat at his desk, staring at the report in front of him. He still felt shaken. The image of that small boy standing up in court and saying two words, "He's lying," wouldn't leave his mind. He realized that day that sometimes justice doesn't come from lawyers or laws. Sometimes it comes from the courage of a child who refuses to stay silent. The morning after that unforgettable day in court, the sky over the small town was gray and heavy, as if it too carried the weight of what had happened. Eli woke up earlier than usual. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then he saw his toy car beside his pillow and remembered everything. He sat up quietly, listening to the sound of rain tapping on the window. His chest felt strange, light but also uncertain. He had told the truth, and now everything was different. His mother came into the room a few minutes later. Her eyes were red from crying all night, but her voice was soft when she spoke. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, sitting down beside him. He looked at her carefully, not sure if she was angry or sad. She gently brushed his hair back and smiled weakly. "You were very brave yesterday," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to go through all that." Eli didn't know what to say. He just leaned against her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him for a long moment as if she was afraid to let go. She wished she had seen the truth earlier, wished she hadn't let someone else fill the space that used to belong to her son's father. She had thought she was protecting Eli, but instead, she had let lies into their lives. Later that morning, the social worker arrived. She was calm but serious, holding a file under her arm. "We need to go to the courthouse again," she said gently. "The judge wants to speak to everyone before making his final decision." Eli nodded quietly. His mother took a deep breath, grabbed her coat, and they left together. The walk to the car was quiet. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't angry anymore. It was full of reflection. At the courthouse, reporters were already waiting outside. Flashing cameras clicked as they entered, but the bailiff kept everyone at a distance. Inside, the courtroom looked the same as the day before, but the feeling was different. The tension had changed. The father was already there, sitting quietly. When he saw Eli and his mother walk in, he stood up. For the first time in years, he looked at her not with resentment, but with understanding. The judge entered, and everyone stood. He looked tired but composed. After everyone sat down, he cleared his throat and began to speak. "Yesterday," he said, "something happened in this courtroom that reminded all of us what honesty and courage look like. I've spent many years behind this bench, but few moments have affected me like what I saw from this young boy." He turned his eyes toward Eli. "You did the right thing, son, and because of that, we will now ensure your safety and peace." Eli's small face stayed serious, but his eyes flickered with a shy light. The judge then looked at the lawyers. "I have ordered an investigation into the testimony given earlier. Until it's complete, the custody decision will not be finalized." The mother nodded slowly, holding back tears. She looked at the floor, ashamed that she had let her son live in fear. The father's eyes softened as he looked at her. The judge continued, "However, the child will be placed in temporary shared care supervised by both parents until further notice. This will allow both of you to rebuild trust not only with each other but with your son." The courtroom stayed silent. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, but it was a start. The judge added, "This isn't about who wins or loses. It's about what's best for the child. Remember that." When court adjourned, the father slowly walked toward the mother. They stood a few feet apart, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he said softly, "I never wanted it to be this way. I just wanted to be part of his life." She looked up at him, eyes wet. "I know," she said. "I was angry for too long. I thought keeping you away was protecting him. But I was wrong." There was a long silence before she whispered, "I'm sorry." The father hesitated, then nodded. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "For him." Eli watched from a few steps away, not fully understanding the words, but feeling the change in the air. For the first time, his parents weren't yelling or walking away from each other. They were talking. It gave him a small sense of hope. The following days were full of change. Social services arranged meetings for both parents to spend time with Eli separately at first, under supervision. The sessions were awkward at the start, especially for the father who didn't know what to say. But Eli helped bridge the silence. He talked about school, his friends, and his favorite shows. Slowly, his father began to smile more. He brought snacks, helped with homework, and started showing up not as someone fighting for custody, but as a father who just wanted to be there. Meanwhile, the mother attended counseling sessions arranged by the court. She realized how much anger and fear had shaped her choices. She began to focus on healing instead of defending herself. When she picked Eli up from his father's house for the first time, she was surprised to see how comfortable he looked there. There were toys scattered around, drawings on the fridge, and a new bookshelf filled with storybooks. The father had turned his small apartment into a home that felt warm and safe. One evening, during a scheduled visit, Eli sat with both his parents in a family therapy session. The counselor asked them to write one thing they wanted for their son's future. The father wrote, "I want him to feel proud of me someday." The mother wrote, "I want him to never feel scared again." When they shared what they had written, both looked at each other with tears in their eyes. Eli smiled quietly, holding their hands on each side. Weeks passed, and the investigation into the false testimony continued. The judge received reports confirming that the mother's boyfriend had indeed lied to manipulate the case. He had told stories to damage the father's image and maintain control over the family. The truth was undeniable. The boyfriend faced legal consequences for his actions, but the judge kept his focus on helping the family recover, not tearing anyone apart. One afternoon, the judge called both parents and Eli to his office for a private meeting. He wasn't wearing his robe this time, just a plain suit looking more like a kind grandfather than a strict judge. He smiled at Eli. "You've grown up a lot in the last few weeks," he said kindly. "How are you feeling now?" Eli thought for a moment. "Better," he said softly. "It's quiet now at home." The judge nodded. "That's good. You deserve peace." He then turned to the parents. I've seen hundreds of families in this room, he said, but very few learn to truly listen. You both have a chance to rewrite your story. Don't waste it. They both nodded quietly. For the first time, there was no tension in their voices, only respect. Outside the courthouse that day, the air felt lighter. The father offered to walk them to the car. The mother didn't refuse. They talked about simple things, school, groceries, and Eli's favorite meals. It felt strange but natural at the same time. When they reached the car, the father bent down and hugged his son. I'm proud of you, buddy, he whispered. You were brave when even grown-ups couldn't be. Eli smiled shyly and hugged him back. I just told the truth, he said simply. The father smiled, his eyes full of pride. Sometimes that's the hardest thing in the world. That night, Eli lay in bed once more, staring at the ceiling. The world felt calmer now. There were no more shouting matches, no more scary secrets. His toy car rested beside him like always. But tonight he didn't need it to feel brave. He already was. In another part of town, the judge sat at his desk, writing the closing notes on the case. His hand paused halfway through the page. He thought about that moment in court, how a little boy's voice had stopped everything and changed the truth everyone thought they knew. He smiled faintly, then wrote his final words. Justice begins when someone has the courage to speak. As for Eli's parents, things weren't perfect, but they were better. The father began visiting every weekend, sometimes staying for dinner. The mother, once guarded, now found herself asking about his work, his health, his days. They weren't together, but they had become something equally important. Two people learning how to be a family again, one small step at a time. Months later, when the case was officially closed, the judge signed the final order granting shared custody. He added a personal note in the file that said, both parents have demonstrated growth and mutual respect. Child appears safe, stable, and happy. That line, more than any legal decision, carried real meaning. Eli's story became known across the town. People spoke about it for weeks, not because it was dramatic, but because it reminded them that truth can come from the smallest voices. Teachers at his school looked at him differently with quiet admiration. He didn't understand why, they were just words after all. But to everyone else, those words had changed everything. Years later, when Eli grew older, he would still remember that day in court. The cold air, the wooden floors, the judge's calm voice, and how his heart had raced before he spoke. He didn't know it then, but that moment had taught him something powerful. That truth, no matter how small it seems, can make even the strongest walls crumble. And though time passed and life moved on, one thing never changed. The quiet strength of a boy who stood up for what was right, even when no one expected him to. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the scribbling of the clerk's pen. The long day had drained everyone's energy. The mother sat with her lawyer, eyes fixed on the judge, her hands nervously twisting a tissue. The father sat quietly on the other side, shoulders slumped but eyes steady, waiting for the final words that would decide his life. Eli sat between two social workers on the front bench. His small legs dangled from the wooden seat, not touching the floor. He looked tired, but his eyes were alert, moving from his mother to his father and back again. No one had asked him what he wanted. No one ever did. He felt invisible, like a piece of paper passed back and forth between adults who spoke in heavy words he didn't understand. The judge, an older man with a calm but stern face, adjusted his glasses and began reading his notes. The lawyers sat still, their files closed, their expressions unreadable. Everyone in that room seemed to hold their breath. The judge's tone was steady, but there was something heavy in the air. The kind of silence that happens before a storm breaks. After hours of testimonies and questions, the case was finally coming to an end. The judge looked up and began to speak. His voice echoed in the wooden courtroom. After careful consideration, he said, pausing as he scanned both parents, this court must decide what is best for the child. Eli's mother straightened her back, clutching her tissue tighter. The father lowered his eyes, bracing for the worst. The judge continued. It is evident that both parents care for their son deeply. However, the environment in which a child grows must be stable, safe, and nurturing. He paused, glancing at his papers again before looking toward the mother's side of the courtroom. The mother has provided evidence of consistent care and emotional stability over the past 2 years. Therefore, he didn't get to finish. A small voice suddenly cut through the silence. He's lying. The words were so soft, yet they hit the room like thunder. Everyone froze. Heads turned. The judge stopped mid-sentence and looked up sharply. The voice came from the front bench. Eli stood up. His hands trembled as he looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on one of the witnesses who had testified earlier, the mother's boyfriend. The man shifted in his seat, his face turning pale. The judge blinked, confused. "What did you say, son?" Eli swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper. "He's lying." A stunned murmur rippled through the courtroom. The mother's lawyer tried to stand, stammering something about the child being emotional, but the judge raised his hand to silence everyone. "Everyone sit down," the judge said firmly. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Eli, come here, please." Eli looked at the social worker beside him, unsure. She nodded gently, and he slowly walked toward the witness stand. His small shoes made soft sounds against the wooden floor. When he reached the front, the judge spoke again, his tone calm but curious. "Eli," he said softly, "can you tell me what you mean by that?"
"Who is lying?"
Eli hesitated. His lips quivered as he glanced at his mother, who was staring at him in shock. Her boyfriend avoided eye contact completely, looking down at his shoes. "That man," Eli said, pointing a small finger toward the boyfriend. "He said things that aren't true. My dad never did what he said." The courtroom fell completely silent again. The judge looked from Eli to the man, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're saying your father didn't do what the witness claimed?" Eli nodded quickly. "He didn't hurt me. He never did. That man told me to say it when we went to the office before." Gasps filled the room. The judge's pen rolled off the table, hitting the floor with a soft clink. The boyfriend's face had gone pale, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The mother stood up suddenly, her face drained of color. "Eli, stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Honey, it's okay, just sit down." But Eli didn't stop. He took a step forward, his small fists clenched. "He told me to lie," he said, his voice louder now. "He said if I didn't say that stuff, I'd get my dad in trouble. But it wasn't true. Dad didn't do anything bad." The judge took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at the boy standing before him, trembling, but brave enough to speak. Then quietly, the judge said, "Court will take a short recess." He stood and gestured for the bailiff to escort Eli to his chambers. The mother started to protest, but the judge raised his hand again. "Mrs., please remain seated. I'll speak with the child privately." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as everyone watched Eli disappear behind the wooden door with the judge. The mother buried her face in her hands, whispering something no one could hear. The father just sat there, stunned, tears filling his eyes for the first time that day. Inside the judge's office, the atmosphere was quieter, calmer. The judge sat behind his desk, and Eli sat on a small chair across from him. A social worker stayed nearby for comfort. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You did something very brave back there," the judge said softly. "But I need to understand. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Eli hesitated, then nodded. His voice was small but steady. "That man, he lives with Mom. He told me to say that Dad got angry one time and threw things. But it wasn't Dad, it was him. He yelled a lot. I got scared sometimes." The judge listened carefully, his face turning pale as Eli spoke. "Why didn't you tell anyone before?" he asked gently. Eli looked down at his hands. "Because he said if I told, Mom would get in trouble. And I didn't want her to cry." The judge's heart sank. He leaned back slowly, letting out a quiet sigh. He had seen many cases over the years, but there was something about this one, about this boy, that shook him deeply. "Children didn't lie about fear like that. Eli," he said after a pause. "Thank you for telling me the truth. You did the right thing." Eli nodded quietly. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. The judge stood and walked over, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You can go back to the social worker now. I'll take care of the rest." When the judge returned to the courtroom 15 minutes later, everyone could see that his face was pale. The room went silent as he took his seat. He looked at both parents, then at the lawyers, and finally at the witness stand where the boyfriend sat uncomfortably. The judge's tone was calm but sharp. "After hearing the additional statement from the child, this court has reason to believe that certain testimonies may not have been truthful." The boyfriend shifted uneasily. The mother's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge continued, his voice firmer now. The welfare of the child is the court's top priority. Any false statements made in this courtroom will be taken very seriously. He turned his gaze toward the mother, who sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. It appears your child has revealed information that requires further investigation. Until then, the court will not finalize the custody order today. The father looked stunned, then emotional. He didn't move or speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. The mother tried to speak, her voice trembling. Your Honor, he's just confused. But the judge interrupted. No, he's not. He spoke clearly, and his statement is consistent. He paused, his face still pale. This child may have just spoken the truth that many adults tried to hide. The courtroom was silent again. No one dared to move. Eli was brought back into the room holding the social worker's hand. He looked tired but calm, his small face brave in front of so many staring eyes. When the judge met his gaze, he gave him a small nod, one that said, "You did well." The judge's voice softened as he addressed the court. This session will be postponed until a full child welfare review is completed. The court thanks the young witness for his honesty. The gavel hit the block, echoing through the silent courtroom. The decision that day was not final, but everyone knew. The truth had changed everything. As people began to leave, the judge sat back in his chair, still pale. His hand shook slightly as he picked up his glasses. He had seen many trials in his career, but he would never forget this one. The day a small boy stood up, spoke 2 words, and changed the entire course of justice. The sound of the gavel still echoed in the judge's ears long after the courtroom had emptied. The room that had once been filled with whispers, tension, and arguments was now silent. Only the faint rustle of papers remained as the clerks packed their files. The judge sat still in his chair, staring at the empty witness stand where the little boy had stood earlier. His heart felt heavier than usual. He had seen hundreds of cases in his career, some tragic, some cruel, some unbelievable, but this one felt different. There was something haunting about how the child had spoken. No hesitation, no confusion, just 2 small words that turned the entire case upside down. Outside the courthouse, the father waited with his lawyer, standing near the old stone steps. The air was cool and the evening sun was fading behind the clouds. He looked tired, but there was a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched as the social worker walked out with Eli, who looked up at him shyly. The father knelt down to his son's level. "Hey," he said softly, afraid to say too much. "You okay?" Eli nodded, clutching his small backpack. "I told the truth, Dad." The father's eyes filled with tears. He reached out and gently pulled Eli into his arms. "You did," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You really did." For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The city noise faded, the world around them quieted, and it was just the 2 of them. A father holding his son after months of uncertainty and heartbreak. The social worker smiled softly and stepped aside to give them a moment. "He'll need to stay with me tonight," she reminded gently. "The court hasn't made a final decision yet." The father nodded, letting go reluctantly. "I understand. Just tell him I love him, all right?" Eli looked up and smiled faintly. "I know," he said before following the social worker toward the waiting car. The father stood there until they drove away, his heart full of both pride and pain. He knew this wasn't the end, but for the first time in a long while, he believed that maybe the truth was finally on his side. Back inside the courthouse, the judge sat in his office with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He reviewed his notes, the testimonies, and the transcripts of the day. Every word the boy said played in his mind. "He told me to lie. I didn't want Mom to cry." Those words echoed like a bell he couldn't unhear. The judge sighed deeply. He had seen adults lie in court for money, for revenge, for pride, but when a child spoke from the heart, it carried a kind of weight no evidence could match. Later that week, the judge ordered a special child welfare review. Investigators visited both homes, spoke to neighbors, and quietly checked the background of the mother's boyfriend. It didn't take long before hidden details began to surface. Complaints from neighbors, old police reports of noise and shouting, small pieces that started to fit together like a puzzle. When the report finally landed on the judge's desk, he read it in silence. By the end, his face had gone pale again, just like it had that day in court. The report confirmed what the boy had said. The man living with the mother had a history of aggression. It wasn't proof of harm, but it was enough to raise serious concern. The judge sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. He knew what he had to do. A week later, the courtroom filled again. The air felt heavier this time. The mother sat quietly, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. She looked exhausted, her face pale and her eyes red from lack of sleep. The boyfriend wasn't in the room. He had been asked to stay away pending investigation. The father sat still, his hands folded tightly, his eyes on the floor. Eli sat near the social worker again, holding the same small toy car he always carried. When the judge entered, everyone rose. His expression was calm but serious. He looked at each person before speaking. "This court has reviewed the findings from the Child Welfare Department," he began, "and after thorough consideration, it is clear that there were inconsistencies in earlier testimonies." The mother closed her eyes. The father looked up, hardly daring to breathe. The judge continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "This court believes that both parents love their child. However, due to recent findings, it is necessary to take temporary measures to ensure the child's safety and emotional well-being." He paused before looking at the father. "Custody will be shared under supervision for the next 6 months. The child will spend equal time with both parents while the court continues to monitor the situation." A quiet gasp came from the back of the room. The father's eyes widened slightly. The mother covered her face with her hands. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the court requests mandatory counseling sessions for both parents and a continued investigation into the living environment of the mother's residence. The child's welfare remains the highest priority." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the father stood slowly, his voice low but steady. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "No, mister," he said softly. "Thank your son. His honesty has helped us all see the truth." Eli looked up from his seat, his small face serious but calm. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could tell something had changed. Something good. After the hearing ended, the judge stayed behind again as everyone left. He sat in silence for a while, staring at the empty courtroom. There was a strange mix of relief and sadness inside him. Relief that justice had found its way through the noise, and sadness that a child had to carry such a heavy truth. As he gathered his papers, he noticed a drawing left behind on the witness bench. It was a simple picture drawn in pencil. A house, a sun, and 3 stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Me, Mom, and Dad, happy." The judge held the paper for a long moment. He smiled faintly, though his eyes looked tired. He placed it carefully inside his folder before turning off the courtroom lights. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly began to settle. The father followed every rule the court gave him. He attended counseling, found a steadier job, and began rebuilding a safe place for his son. Each weekend he spent with Eli felt like a gift. Long walks in the park, quiet dinners, small talks before bedtime. Eli was different too. He smiled more, spoke freely, and laughed in ways he hadn't before. There were still nights he woke up from bad dreams, but his father was always there to comfort him, reminding him that he was safe. The mother went through her own changes. After the investigation, she decided to end her relationship with the boyfriend. It wasn't easy, and there were tears and regret, but deep down she knew she had to protect her child. She also attended therapy, learning to face her own pain and mistakes. Months later, when the family returned to court for a review, things looked different. The tension that once filled the room was gone. The judge noticed it right away, the way both parents sat calmly, the way Eli sat between them smiling faintly. When the hearing ended, the judge spoke kindly. "I'm proud of all of you," he said. "Families make mistakes, but the most important thing is learning to protect what truly matters: love and trust." Eli looked up and asked innocently, "Does that mean we're okay now?" The judge smiled warmly. "Yes, Eli, I believe you are." As they left the courtroom, the father placed his hand gently on Eli's shoulder. The mother walked beside them, quiet but peaceful. It wasn't a perfect family, not yet, but it was a start. Outside, the sky was clear and bright. Eli reached up and took both his parents' hands, one in each of his. He smiled and said softly, "Can we go get ice cream?" The father chuckled, glancing at the mother, who laughed for the first time in months. "I think that's a great idea," she said. And so they walked down the courthouse steps together, not as enemies, but as a family slowly finding their way back to peace. From the window above, the judge watched them for a moment before turning away. He felt a quiet satisfaction in his heart, the kind that comes when justice doesn't just follow the law but touches something deeper, something human. He thought again about those two small words that had changed everything. He's lying. Words that had uncovered the truth, saved a father, and given a child the voice he deserved. Sometimes the judge realized it wasn't the lawyers or the evidence that brought justice. It was courage. And in this case, it had come from the smallest person in the room. He turned off the last light in his office and walked out into the cool evening air. For the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet peace, the kind that comes when truth finally wins.